I'm joined by Arfiya Eri, member of the House of Representatives of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, and we're so delighted that you've come out from Tokyo. Arfiya took up office in April 2023 and leads a district in Chiba, which is fairly close to Tokyo on the right-hand side. Within months of taking office, Time magazine had named you in their top 100 list for next generation global leaders. Melanie Perkins, the Australian CEO of Canva, was on that list last year. Sophia Smith, that very, very good US football player who scored some crucial goals that helped the US win a gold at the recent Olympics. JD Vance was positioned next to you on that list. It was a very eclectic and very high-powered list. Your entrance into Japanese politics over the last few years has attracted a fair bit of attention in Japan for a number of reasons. In Japan, approximately 90% of parliamentarian or ministerial positions are held by men. You're about 20 years younger than the average age of a politician in Japan. You have Uyghur Uzbek heritage. You speak a lot of different languages, which makes me feel very embarrassed. English, Chinese, Uzbek, Turkish, Uyghur and Arabic, in addition to Japanese. You've previously said in Japanese media that you felt compelled to run because of the worsening security environment and the visible threats to democracies. And one of those threats that we've really seen play out in the past few years in Japan has been cyber-enabled foreign interference and campaigns of disinformation. So I'm very keen to talk to you about that topic in a little bit. It's come up a lot these past few days, even unprompted in sessions about other topics for very good reason. But first I'm going to kick off on another topic. And for the audience, I'm only going to ask Arfiya a few questions. And then I'll try to save 5 to 8 minutes for Q&A, and I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. I've actually strangely lived in Japan for the last 2.5 years. I've been living in Tokyo, wrapping up my time there really, really soon. And I was quite surprised by the real lack of women and the lack of diversity in political roles, and often across major industry as well. It was more noticeable than I ever thought it was going to be. And you've really cracked through what is, I think, a multi-layered, incredibly thick glass ceiling in Japan in a very unique way. So I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that journey of yours, some of the challenges you may have faced along the way, and where you see the opportunity for emerging leaders coming through in a country as big as Japan.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And what a great job ASPI has done in the past 2 days. I know you guys have been working so hard to get us all together, so thank you. Can we get a round of applause for the staff here? You guys have done such a great job. And also thank you to everyone holding on towards the end of a very long and intellectually stimulating 2 days. Thank you so much for being here. One of the reasons I ran for office, as you mentioned, is, of course, threats I was seeing to democracy while working at the UN, my personal experience being a Uyghur Japanese, and seeing my own personal sort of freedoms shrink, even as a Japanese national, as crackdown in the Uyghur region worsened over time. But another reason was, working at the UN, I could see over the years how rapidly our world was changing and the rapid progress we were making on diversity and inclusion. Year after year, we would have delegations come for the General Assembly, and each delegation from every country would look more and more diverse. We would have more women represented, we would have more ethnic minorities represented, we would have more young people represented. And I would sit on the side of the UN behind the Secretary General, looking at each delegation with awe. Except when Japan came, every single year, year after year after year after year, my lovely country, Japan, would just only have men of a specific age group with a specific career background who probably come from a specific family and economic background. I knew growing up in Japan that that was not the image of our country, but I felt so sad that this was the image that we were presenting to the rest of the world. I also knew that there were so many Japanese people just like myself, but I didn't see any of them represented in any of our delegations going abroad. And when I looked into our politics, it was even worse. Not only did we not have anybody like me in the political world, we didn't have candidates like me. So I thought, well, if I don't feel represented in my own democracy, but I'm surrounded by Japanese people who are just like me, there must be so many more people who just don't feel represented. And if I wanted to see change, I probably had to do it myself. And so I called our current digital minister, Taro Kono, who I knew from prior, and I basically said to him that I'll run just to make a statement, but I don't intend to win. And his response was, well, if you don't win, the message will be that candidates like you yourself will not be elected to office. So why would that encourage other people like you to run? And so we have to find an election for you where you can definitely win. So I was like, okay. And when I returned to Tokyo, he introduced me to Taro Aso, our current vice chair of the LDP, who is also from Fukuoka, where I'm from. I said to him what I just said to you, and he said, well, you should be running in the next 2 months. And so I said, okay, am I quitting my job? And he was like, yeah, just come back, run, it'll be fine. So I came back from New York, packed things up, got parachuted into an upper house election as a national proportionate representation candidate. Now, what that means is that anybody who was a Japanese national could vote for me. But because it was a national PR election, I had 100 other people I was running against, and I had to have Japanese people think, well, this is the one person I want as my national representative. My name is very difficult in Japanese, Arfiya Eri. I've kept my Uyghur name. And I had no fame, no capital. All I had was this LDP platform and 6 weeks to run my campaign. So in 6 weeks, we ran a mostly online-based campaign and an urban area-based campaign. I argued that our country was better and that it was more diverse and it was more inclusive, and it was about time we had some representation about that. In 6 weeks, we had 54,000 plus people write my name on the ballot. A very difficult name to remember, still agreeing with the argument that I had. It wasn't enough to get me elected, but it was enough to get some attention as to what I was arguing, what other people in Japan were thinking. And so in 6 months' time, we had a by-election in Chiba 5, the constituency I represent now, an urban area constituting of 2 cities, Ichikawa and Urayasu. A very diverse, very young, and very urban and progressive district where the LDP, my predecessor, had to leave his job due to a funds embezzlement issue. The LDP decided that we only had 9 weeks to run. Everybody hated us. We needed something new and something that could give us hope. And so I was asked to put my hat in this election, got the nomination, ran in 9 weeks, and we did win that one. So I guess that's my journey. But all that to say, I think a lot of the attention that I've been getting and accolades I've been getting for being such a minority in the Japanese political world, I don't think it says much about my capabilities as a politician. I think it says a lot about the 2 wonderful cities I represent and how progressive and inclusive those cities are, and the difference that we've been able to make through this election, and also just within 1 year of me being in office as well.
It's a fantastic story and really shows you, I suppose, that there was a thirst for change there that maybe hadn't truly been uncovered in that region. I'm going to take a bit of a change now. I was digging into a lot of media interviews you've been doing over the past few years, and I found this quote that I really loved. That was, you said, "I think there's an overwhelming sense that Japan is declining, and I just don't think that's true." And I thought you were just really spot on there with both parts of that statement. I think there's been a view that's been held for a long time that we are starting to maybe see shift now over the last few years. Japan is sort of, I think, changing quite rapidly. It's leading a global conversation on, economic coercion and the importance of economic security. It held the G7 last year, and someone talked about Japan adding AI to the agenda there. They brought in new national security and defence strategies quite recently. Major technological initiatives are being shored up, including trying to rebuild its semiconductor chip industry with TSMC, Taiwan's TSMC, building, I think, 2 plants. One's opening quite soon, the other next year. There's a lot going on in battery development, cyber security, stepping up regional relationships, including the Pacific. I don't know if people watch this, and we've had a debate about multilaterals already over the past 2 days. I'm very pro multilaterals, and there's a really booming US, South Korea, Japan multilateral going on that appears to be run by the national security advisors that's just meeting up all over the shop. There's so much going on, and I think there's a lot that the rest of us can learn from Japan. Momentum is building, but amidst all this activity, there are, of course, different gaps and challenges. There always are. So my question to you is, what is your take on Japan in the world in 2024, and what is the trajectory you see and or would want to see from Japan?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think Japan, as well as our democratic partners, I think we are all in the same situation. I think we're being called to rise and step up to the plate. These 2 days, I think, have highlighted that we live in a very turbulent time in the context of shrinking space for civil rights, shrinking space for democracy, shrinking space for human rights worldwide. We're seeing authoritarianism rise worldwide, rise of populism, extremism, not least due to rise of social media as well, and lack of regulation on algorithms that encourage that. And during that time, Japan has, I think, post-World War II, we've always been a very peaceful, neutral partner to many of our friends. And I think we're being called to rise and do a little more. I think we're being called to rise as a democratic leader in Asia. I always argue in my constituency and in the capital that Japan, we should not forget that we are still the strongest democratic economy in Asia. And there is a sense of leadership that we must hold, a sense of responsibility and accountability that comes with that. At the same time, Japan has friends in places where our Western partners may struggle a little bit. We have very long-term close ties with Iran. We have close ties with Myanmar. We also have, a little bit of a different diplomatic relationship with China. As human rights and peace and security issues amount in these areas, Japan, as a friend to the West, and as a partner in values to the West, and as the only Asian country in G7, I think has a space to do more and must do more. We must be a bridge between the Asian world and the global South and the West. We must be a bridge between countries holding on to democracy and human rights principles that we feel very strongly about, and countries who want to keep their traditions alive. And I'm very excited about where Japan is in 2024. As you've highlighted, we're doing, I think, we're doing a good job, I think, catching up with AI. We need to do a little more, but I think we're leading on AI governance. We're leading on economic security. And I think we need to be doing more with our Western partners as well.
Fantastic. I'm going to now jump to what is one of my favourite topics, and it's, I think, a topic that you know really well and have such a unique insight to. After this question, I am going to go to Q&A. Let's talk cyber-enabled interference and disinformation. Japan's had a real wake-up call, and I don't know that this is super well known outside of Japan over the past 2 years. Partially, I want to say that started in 2023 when the Chinese government started ramping up what was a multi-year propaganda and covert social media campaign targeting Japan's release of wastewater from an earthquake-stricken Fukushima-based nuclear power plant. Separate to that, there was also campaigns targeting Japan's role in the Quad and Japan's plans to deploy missiles in Okinawa. In both cases, actually, ASPI staff did investigative work, attributed those campaigns, provided data sets to social media platforms who want them, who could do their own takedowns and investigations. I'll flag in both cases, these state-backed information campaigns posed mostly as foreigners and mostly as women. It's a combination of AI-created profiles and real women who had no idea their profiles had been stolen for this malicious activity. In addition to this targeting of Japanese politics and policies, you yourself have had very personal experience with being an online target for such campaigns. My colleague Bethany, the head of our China program, said that if she tweets about you, her replies quickly get absolutely swamped.
I'm sorry.
targeted by bots and inauthentic activity and state-backed activity. So I have a two-part question for you, and maybe as a part of it you can tell me if that's normal for other politicians or very unique. How do you think Japan is generally tracking in efforts to counter and deter these types of cyber-enabled campaigns? What more could be done? And secondly, talk us through your personal experience with this sort of activity.
Sure. So I've personally experienced how horrible these cyber-enabled campaigns are. Yesterday, I think a speaker talked about how she got 90 hate speeches a day. During my election, I got about 1,000 hate posts almost a day, I think per day. And they would go viral. And they would be, sort of cutouts from my Instagram lives that I assume was altered in terms of, I was still saying what I was saying, but they would alter the speed of my speech and the tone of my speech to have me sound more violent than I usually do. There would also be cutouts of interviews, of answers that I've given that are totally taken out of context to sort of present me as someone who is pro-China, a Uyghur candidate, as pro-China, a Chinese spy, here to destroy Japanese traditions and identity. And alongside that would be, attacks on things I stand for and I advocate for, which include gender parity, rights of women and children in Japan, as well as rights of our LGBTQ friends, as well as rights of hyphenated Japanese people, just like myself. So a lot of the concerns I had during my campaign wasn't only just hate speech against me, but how that would appear to people who are already minorities in our society and the messaging they would get in terms of what people might be saying about them. I found it really important to advocate that in real life, I had never, in both of my campaign runs, encountered hate speech during my campaign rallies. Usually people would be very polite. They would come to my rally. They would have read things online. And within 5 minutes or so, they would have completely changed their minds. And even today, when I go to my constituency, which is every day, I have to do the work with every single person at the grassroots to debunk what they have read online about me. And it is things like, she's not Japanese enough. She became Japanese yesterday. And so I tell them, no, I was born and raised here. And it shocks them, right? She doesn't live in our constituency. And I tell them, no, I do live, I live down the street. To things like, oh, she hates Japan. She is pro-China. Her nomination was bought off by a Japanese corporation that is pro-China. Every single one of those things I have to debunk, but I get to debunk as part of my grassroots work. And what I was mentioning to Bethany yesterday was, these days I think I get about maybe 20 to 30 hate posts or disinformation posts a day. But I also get about 10 to 15 apology posts a week. So people would read news coverages about the work we've done from our constituency, or what I put out on my own social media myself, and they would then post an apology and say, I had no idea that this was who you were. I'm very embarrassed for what I said about you. I am so sorry that I believed in disinformation. And so when we talk about what we've been talking about in the past 2 days, about people not having the right information to make right decisions about specific things about themselves, it is a direct attack on our democracy. It is important to me that every single one of my constituents get and have the right to have correct information about every single candidate they can vote for, and then make an informed decision on who they should vote for. And that doesn't have to be me, but they have the right to know who they are voting for. And right now, that right is being stripped of our constituency just because we have a Uyghur Japanese candidate, and that's not okay. And to answer the first part of your question, I don't think we're doing enough as the Japanese government to tackle these things. I think we're just now realizing how much vulnerabilities we have to cybersecurity attacks. And much of our focus has been on more of the national security aspect of it. But we really need to be pivoting to the democracy and information security aspect of it as well.
I got the feeling when the different bits of the campaign that was targeting the wastewater issue, certainly as an outsider, it seemed to take the Japanese government by surprise. There was this You know, it was covert social media, it was a lot of state propaganda, and it all came together. And it took the Japanese government a while to kick into gear. And when they did, they were suddenly having to counter and defend themselves all over social media. They were having to talk to governments because this disinformation was spreading really quickly. Now, the time's going orange, which is quite stressful. Let's open it up for Q&A. As MC, I'm going to take a few more minutes. I'd love to take 2 or 3 questions at the same time. It's a bit hard to see. I can see lots of hands at the back there. Why don't we take 2 or 3? So we'll start at the back with Arfiya.
Hi, Arfiya Eri from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. My question is around the value of diversity when it comes to politics and international affairs. I think this is an issue as well that we can see in Australia and the US and a lot of other countries around concerns around the tokenism of having diverse voices, whether that's gender or racial minorities. So I'd love to hear from your experience around what is the value of integrating increasingly diverse perspectives and to overcome some of that rhetoric and really push back on some of that toxic rhetoric we hear around diversity.
Perfect. Thanks, Arfiya. I've got 1 or 2. Here we go. Kate?
Do you want it now?
Yes. We'll take more.
Thanks so much for the question. Building on that, I wonder if you had any thoughts about what more governments can and should do to combat disinformation about candidates, because it strikes me that it's the women and the marginalised groups that end up doing the enormous labour of personally going and speaking to people. I can't imagine that male candidates have to do that. So I think if governments care about democracy, they care about upfront combating that disinformation. Thanks. Oh, and Kate O'Shaughnessy from the Perth US Asia Centre.
Do we have one more from the floor, or else I'll sneak in? Daria?
Thank you for all your remarks. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more about whether Japan is doing enough to protect the Uyghur community or, other communities that might be, persecuted elsewhere and might be getting attacked by foreign governments through, foreign interference or espionage and all that sort of stuff. Thank you.
Have we got one more, or are we all good? Nathan.
Hey, thank you for talking. So you've got a very unique experience being a Uyghur woman, being a high-level UN staffer, and now being a representative for a democratic government. Do you have any advice to sort of officials from whatever country here, from your time at the UN now that you can speak quite freely, on how to maybe encourage the UN to be more effective, especially considering the quote-unquote, like you were there during the quote-unquote response to the Uyghur emergency, and sort of any takeaways from that for officials here?
Oh, these are all great questions. I could write a book.
Yeah.
So 20 seconds per question, I think.
No, you can take longer. You can take longer.
Thank you. On tokenism, I'm so glad you asked that question. One of the things I focus on in my political activity is to focus less on diversity and to focus more on inclusion and representation. And this is a new vocabulary for the Japanese sort of political world as well. I do get characterized often as a symbol of diversity for the LDP. I do not call myself that. I don't want to be called that. I always emphasize that I am a representative of Chiba 5. I look like Chiba 5, I sound like Chiba 5, and I talk like Chiba 5. And that is the statement I always make when people talk about my hyphenated identity or me being a young woman. And the reason for that is because our constituency is so close to Tokyo. I have the privilege of traveling there every single day. And what I always tell my constituents is that whenever I'm in Tokyo, it is very true that only 10% of the lower house where I am is women. Even less are millennials like myself. I am usually the only person with my voice in rooms where we're discussing everything from immigration to marriage laws, to family laws, to domestic violence, to economy, to finance. But then I go back to Chiba 5, and I'd just be standing in front of a station, and within 10 minutes, I would see 10 women who look just like me. I am so blendable that people don't realize that I am an MP until I'm like 20 minutes in somewhere buying sushi, and they're like, oh, I voted for you. I didn't know it was you. And that is something I'm very, very proud of that we've been able to accomplish at Chiba 5, is that we now have one seat, at least, that looks like us, that talks like us, that thinks like us, and that feels like us. And that empowers me to say whatever the hell I want in Tokyo, even if it feels like a minority opinion, because I know that I am representing a majority opinion where I come from. So to answer your question on how do we get rid of toxic tokenism, I think we need to be focusing much more on, are we representing all the voices that need to be represented within a democracy, and who is representing us, and are they doing that well? And they don't have to come from a specific, I think, identity to do that. But our representatives need to be doing their jobs well. They need to be out there speaking with you, listening to you, and representing you. And we should be voting for people who do that well, regardless of what they look like or what their identities might be like. On governments combating disinformation, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I wish my government would do more. But then, I think the comeback to that is that, well, isn't that your job to make regulation and law as well? And then that's also true. One of the things we've been trying to do with like-minded colleagues, in Japan at least, is to have guardrails in place to make it a little more difficult for people to be spewing hate speech and disinformation online. We've made it possible for anonymous accounts to be disclosed if there is a reasonable, plausible cause for them to have their identities be revealed, and that includes things like violence and hate speech. We are trying to sort of carry on a debate about disinformation as well, and how to create regulations against disinformation and to hold anonymous accounts as well, accountable for spreading disinformation, but we're very much still on our way there. But overall, I think where we should be getting is, I always say to my Japanese colleagues, in the Japanese media, for example, news agencies are held accountable for not using specific terms, derogatory terms, or hateful terms, or racist terms, or sexist terms, discriminatory terms, and they are held accountable for doing that because they hold public channels on television or the radio. Now, social media is also a public platform now. If you are going to engage in a public platform, you should be held accountable for your behavior and the speech and the thought that you're sort of spreading out there. I think freedom of speech always should come with responsibility of speech. And I would like to see all governments move forward in treating social media as a public platform, as we would do to violence on the streets and violent and hate speech in normal public media as well, mainstream public media as well. On the Uyghur community in Japan, thank you for that question. One of the frustrations I have with how Japan has dealt with the Uyghur human rights crisis is that we have not been able to, as a parliament, pass a statement condemning China on what it has been doing on the Uyghurs. We have been able to do so for Ukraine and for Gaza, but when it comes to the Uyghur issue, it's been very difficult for us to pass any sort of statement condemning China. One of the reasons reasons presented by MPs who disagree with such action is always that we don't have enough evidence that human rights abuse is happening. And frankly, I think, I've worked on human rights issues at the UN, I've worked on multiple genocides as well. No other genocide ongoing in real time has had this much evidence revealed as the human rights abuse was ongoing. We haven't seen it. This is historical. We have historical amount of evidence on the Uyghur issue. And yet in Japan, we don't have enough expertise, frankly, to analyze evidence that's coming out. And we don't have enough experts who can advise MPs on what is evidential and what is not, which is why I am so grateful for ASPI's work on the Xinjiang project, your work on satellite imagery. It gives us so much more visible evidence to present to people who have power to do more with evidence that is undeniable. So thank you for your work. And another point I would add is that Japan, being in its position, probably would not hesitate to do more on the Uyghur issue, say more on the Uyghur issue, if the UN were to do more and say more, which leads to the fourth question on how to encourage the UN to do better. my lessons learned from having worked at the UN for 5 years and being political affairs, human rights, security, management, many aspects of the institution, is that the United Nations is an institution that is reflective of our present time in a perfect way. Member states make up the United Nations. If member states are not courageous, if they are not brave in standing up for human rights, the United Nations does not get a mandate to do more on human rights. So my commitment as an MP is to consistently be courageous and be honest wherever I see abuse, wherever in the world. And I encourage my colleagues to do the same, and I hope that all governments do the same, that we are brave, that we are honest, that we stand up for the principles that we believe in, and we, collectively push the UN to do more.
Thank you, Arfiya. That was excellent, and it's such a busy time for the LDP in Japan for politics, so we really appreciate you coming out here and joining us with the Sydney Dialogue. Round of applause for Arfiya, please.
Thank you.